be facilitating today's webinar with the help of several staff, including Heidi Blair, who many of you know, and two of our newer staff, Randy Edwards and Ann Carlson. You will see that our Executive Director, Dina Mansour, is here. I know she is thrilled to see all of you participating. I will provide some background first on why we're talking about this issue. Then we'll have two sets of presenters, all alumni of Mansfield Center programs. The first will provide context for us. Why are there mental health stressors? What are there in various regions of the world, both due to COVID-19 and other factors? Then we'll have a few longer presentations from alumni working more directly in mental health services who will speak about tools and strategies for addressing well-being. We'll end with questions for any of the panelists, so please prepare some for us. We won't be doing breakout sessions today. Our prepared remarks will take about 50 minutes with 20 minutes or so for Q&A. Next slide, Heidi. Here's a slide of where our speakers are from. It's remarkable with Dina's leadership that we have alumni from all around the world, over 1,000 alumni. Today's speakers we drew from Montana in the US, Peru in South America, Mali in West Africa, India, Cambodia, and Sulawesi, Indonesia. With the next slide, I'll provide some framing for our webinar today. So why focus on mental health? Most importantly, we're responding to the interest of our alumni. When we surveyed you a few months ago about what would be interesting in terms of topics, mental health came up as one of the key concerns. Many of you were interested in how COVID is impacting communities around the world mentally, and how do we respond to it? How do we find the passion and energy to do work in these times? So today we want to talk about mental health, why it's important, and how we can support well-being during the pandemic and beyond. To have this conversation, we thought it would be important to first define mental health. We recognize that people think differently about it, about what mental health means from different cultural contexts. But one way to conceptualize it is this. Mental health includes our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It affects how we think, how we feel, and how we act. It also helps determine how we handle stress, relate to others, and make choices. According to the World Health Organization, mental health is not mere absence of mental illness, but it's a state of well-being in which we realize our own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, and are able to make a contribution both to our families and community. Good mental health is core to enabling us to interact, connect, work, and respond to COVID-19. Next slide, please. But the UN has warned of a global mental health crisis due to COVID-19. According to a recent UN policy brief, the mental health and well-being of whole societies have been impacted by this crisis. According to this report, people are feeling distressed by social distancing and isolation, afraid of becoming ill or losing loved ones, fearful of economic turmoil, having lost or being at risk of losing their income and livelihoods, anxious from frequent misinformation and rumors, and in some cases, too much information. There's a higher than usual rate of depression, anxiety, and insomnia being reported in some countries, and increased rates of domestic violence against women and children. Strains on our mental health can manifest in a variety of symptoms, many of which I can personally relate to, including difficulty concentrating, increased irritability, feeling nervous or on edge, moodiness or mood swings, and difficulty sleeping. Some of you maybe have experienced some of these symptoms as well during the pandemic. Next slide. As we were preparing for this webinar and thinking about trying to draw in perspectives from around the world, it became really clear that COVID is just one of our current stressors. It's compounded by others. And this really makes sense from the perspective of the US, where I'm sure you have seen we are facing escalating racial and political tensions, which has revealed deep inequities on top of millions of cases of COVID. All of these issues have triggered even more anxiety. So with the help of our alumni, in this first section, what we want to do is provide a few snapshots from around the world, thinking about mental health and the factors that are affecting our mental health. Our first three presenters are listed there. We're going to begin with Ali Coulibaly from Mali. He was part of the SUSI for Educators program in 2019. He's a high school teacher in Mali, as we'll hear about, a place with many tensions and challenges right now. I've heard he is an amazing teacher and has done incredible work supporting young Indigenous students in Mali. He is also the Press and Cultural Affairs Secretary of Malian Association of Teachers of English. Next, we'll have Danielle from Peru, who was part of our sports diplomacy program in 2019. He's the executive director of Football Más Peru, which promotes resilience and happiness in children and adolescents living in the context of social vulnerability. And then last in this section will be Shreya from India. She was part of the SUSI on Global Environmental Issues program in 2018. She is a graduate student of Global Environmental Studies with a strong focus on gender justice. As you'll see as we go today, our conversations will move from big picture factors influencing mental health and well-being, and then moving more into specific tools and strategies for helping individuals to cope. We invite you to share your own experiences, thoughts, and stories in the chat box. And next, we will now hear from Ali, who will share about conditions and challenges in Mali.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Ali Coulibaly from Mali, as she said. So I'm going to talk about two main points. The first is the challenge we are facing right now in my country during this COVID time, and the second would be the mental health issue. So talking about the challenges we have here in my country, we have three main challenges since. So the first one is the education, and I will start with this since I'm a teacher of English. So since November 1929, our teachers are on strike just before, let's say, the COVID-19. And this is due to the fact that the government has made a decision to increase the salary of all the governmental workers, but they say that teachers are not concerned. To that, and who are really, let's say, doing nothing for the time being. So after that, we have the challenge of the COVID-19. So the COVID-19 is really a huge problem here in our country because most people don't believe it. People think that this is just the creation of our government to really justify some of the money that they have already used before. So they don't trust. That's why they are not using, let's say, they are not practicing and respecting the barrier measures. So another impact of this is that due to the COVID-19, it's clear that many people have lost their job. Even me, I lost one of my job because I have a job and I lost this one, and many of them have done this. And unfortunately, due to that, many people are right now really living in a terrible situation. They need to beg in order really to feed their family. For example, last week I received many calls from friends, from my parents, asking for money, and unfortunately I'm not working as well. So this is a huge problem that I hear, which is the impact, and it is really affecting people emotionally. And another one is that this COVID-19 has really increased also the distrust between the government and the population. So the population, even before, the population do not trust the government, but due to this time, people really don't trust the government. They don't really want to do anything with this. And this is the huge, let's say, one of the main reason that makes it last the 5th, let's say July 5th. So there were a demonstration, so led by religious leaders and some political leaders who demand the resignation of the president. And right now, this has had a huge impact on us because due to that, people are covering them not anything as they used to do, and unfortunate cases of COVID-19 here in our country. So next, I would like to talk about, but before to talk about the mental health issue, so I think that here in my country, the main problem is that people don't trust the government, and they are right somehow because the government are doing everything so that people have not to trust them. And this is the huge problem here, and it's really affecting people mentally, emotionally, and this is like it. So the second point I would like to talk about is the mental health issue. So talking about the mental health issue in Mali, you need to understand a little bit the cultural understanding of the mental issue in my country. So first, there is a common saying. I would like to start with this. People used to say that everybody likes people with mental issue problem, but nobody wants nobody wants to see one of them in his family. So let's say, showing that they don't take care of people who really are suffering from this problem, and they even sometimes laugh at them, and they are victim of stigma, and this is the main problem. And right now in the country, I would say that there is no particular, let's say, measure that the government has made in order to protect those who are suffering from this problem against the COVID-19, because till now, all in the world, in the country, when you go out, you will see still people who are suffering from this across the world, which is not really something good. But people are really changing their mind toward those people now because they think that it's not their fault. And as I said before, sometimes the behavior of people toward those people depends mainly on how they get trouble. So if, for example, it's due to drug, people won't be compassionate. They will not really take care of them because they think that you know what you were doing and you have decided to do it. But when it is due to some other factors like poverty, because many people are suffering from this right now, so people can be really compassionate with you and try to help us as possible as they can. So in general, the impact of the COVID-19 on mental health issue is very, let's say, huge, because here there is nothing specific which has been made, and we have only 2 associations in Mali which really help those people, and it's really a huge problem. So this is what I wanted to really say. Thank you for your attention. If there is any question, then welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. From Mali. Danielle, we'll go next to you.
Okay, hi everybody. My name is Daniel. I'm from Peru. Actually, we have a lot of similarities with what Ali was telling about. For example, I want to start from the education point. Our government took several good decisions in the beginning. Actually, we were one of the South American countries to go on total lockdown from just the beginning of the pandemic. And they had to kind of build a platform in a few weeks in order to get a lot of students, like public school students, so they can continue with the school year. Actually, they built this internet platform, and they have now lessons on TV and on radio, so they can assist almost 6 million students that come from public schools. this has been like the first weeks were really positive, but then like infections kept going. Our numbers of people dying from COVID were not reducing. So this kind of show a lot of the inequality that we have in Peru, because even though they invested a lot of money from the government to give poor people and to help companies so they can keep workers with them, actually 1 month since the lockdown started, almost only 25% of the population had a real job, because informality is very high, has very high rates in Peru. So they became, it became like a big problem between a lot of conditions. In this context, there are like really good stories about, for example, teachers walking long distances through highlands to go to see students that they don't have access to internet or TV or radio, or people trying to modify what they are selling in order to get food for their families, and how they can work in this restriction environment. But right now, it also we are now of the highest rates of infection in South America. So it's been like a lot of good positive things, but in the big picture, we are still in a pandemic crisis, and this it's going to affect families, because there's not only the anxiety of getting infected, but also that they have lost their jobs, that they have to be teachers for their children, and there are a lot of crowded places in Lima where I live. So they are like inside their house, small places. A lot of family has to be with their children, their grandparents, their, I don't know, aunt families. It's a lot of people for smaller places. So what we have been doing in my organization, I would like to share, is that we have been working this problem that can develop on mental health issues too, about sending them videos, posters, different information and activities they can do at home. We work with soccer as a sport to develop these social skills. So we have been sending them a lot of information to the communities we have been working with, not only to get to maintain active, but also to have them give them the opportunity to create spaces where they can talk with their families about how they are feeling, about how children are getting through this pandemic crisis. So as I said before, this has been really difficult for us as a country, like, but also has given us the opportunity to create new spaces and new ways to talk about mental health issues too. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. Shreya. You're still muted.
Well, now, is it good now? All right, thank you. So, hello, my name is Shreya, and I was part of the 2018 batch on SUSE Global Environmental Issues. Today, what I attempt to do in the next 5 minutes is to essentially talk about the issues that we as Indians are facing with regard to COVID, and what are the stressors that can potentially increase the amount of mental health situations in our country. So first of all, what I would like to do is to bring about 3 major problems that we as a society are facing, and potentially try to bring about solutions that we have tried to identify. And I would love to hear from you if there are similar concerns in your countries, and to learn from the best from practices in your own country. So the COVID-19 pandemic in India has brought to the forefront the fragility of our healthcare infrastructure in most of the developing countries. Why this matters is the fact that there were already a considerable amount of social and political stressors that we were facing as Indians. Right before the corona pandemic, we were having intensive political protests, and people were out on the streets. It took a lot of requesting, and it took a lot of considerable amount of pressure from the government to get people inside their households. However, the point about developing nations is that how do you ensure effective hand washing when there is no access to clean water or sanitation? Moreover, how do you ensure that ventilators work in a country where there is not a considerable amount of electricity outreach? And without roads, how do you ensure that ambulances reach people, especially people who are suffering from considerable number of comorbidities and issues right before Corona? So in India, according to the World Health Organization, about 90 million Indians suffer from mental health issues. And the key strategies that the world has agreed upon to treat corona pandemic is essentially isolation and physical distancing. Now, this is even more complicated in a complex and connected society like India. India is going to suffer from a massive mental health crisis, and the factors are going to be multiple, right from alcohol abuse, economic hardship, indebtedness, domestic violence. There are multiple cases that I would like to bring about. So during the COVID-19 crisis, all Indians were not impacted equally. I speak to you from the comfort of my household while recognizing that there are millions of Indians out on the roads trying to make back to their own households and trying to get some peace and some comfort within their families. This crisis had thrown open a facade. The stark reality that we are witnessing here in India is that migrant laborers are walking like hordes of refugees in our own land across states to hundreds of kilometers. And most of them have died out of exhaustion. Many have lost their lives in accidents on roads. What is really sobering to me is to understand that India boasts itself as one of the youngest nations in the world. And most of these people who have died not because of corona, but in spite of it, are between 15 to 30 years of age, which means that had it not been for the accident of their births, they could very well be, spending time with their families, reaching out to friends, or possibly reaching out to people internationally. What I'm trying to point out is there is a considerable amount of systemic bias amongst them for the marginalized. It is also about crossing that threshold that we have constructed within our policy making of we and them. It is to understand that there is no one policy that fits all, especially in complex and complicated societies like India is. We are also up against the contagion of misinformation. And this, I think, is true for most Southeast Asian nations where the rates of illiteracy are completely high. What this means is there is a widespread appetite for misinformation. So the only solution to this can be two-pronged. The first is to curtail the amount of information that is coming out, mostly not from institutional sources, which is where the government needs to step in and talk to the citizens about the kind of approach they will have throughout the crisis. And the second is to really curtail the misinformation about the virus and the amount of information intake that we have as individuals. The third point that I try to make today is that in India, men and women are impacted disproportionately with regard to COVID. Now, physical distancing and stay-at-home orders have had larger implications for women, mostly because 70% of women in our country work in the informal economy, which means that they earn less, they are secure less, and they save less as well. This loss of financial independence, along with the loss of controlling finances, means that they are dependent on the male members of the household. This has made them extremely vulnerable, and the amount of statistics that have come out with regard to domestic violence is extremely scary. And if all of this was not enough, in India, we experienced two major cyclones in the coastal regions of our country. And these were both Category 5 cyclones, which meant that people living along the coast had to be shifted to government shelters. And with that, the rate of coronavirus really increased. Now, the solution that I propose is really telling people what is happening, explaining to them how long this will continue, provide meaningful activities for community interaction and support. We are divided by borders, but we are united by the world. And probably to recognize that and not close our borders and to not close our lives to ourselves is probably the solution to this pandemic. When we talk about the new world order post-corona, the only question that I would like for you to consider is that, is this new world order going to be more inclusive? where this multilateral world order that we speak of, will it also mean that we give more voice and we give more acknowledgement to our communities and to our individuals? Or are we going to again dispossess individuals in our own nations of their rights? And I think that is one question that we as individuals in our own countries need to consider. That's all the time I have. Thank you. I look forward to your comments.
Shreya, thank you so much for that. I see people in the chat box are eager for us to move into talking about strategies to support mental health and well-being. So that's what we have prepared next for you. Our speakers work directly in mental health and will share more specifically about tools and strategies for addressing mental health. We're going to begin with Uni Amalia, who is an alumni from the Waisili Professional Fellows Program in 2019. She is a co-founder of an organization that works with people who have suffered trauma from natural disasters. She works at the village level to improve mental health resilience. Next, after Uni, we'll have Christine Fiore, or Chris, speak. She was an alumni from the Professional Fellows Program in 2012 in Thailand. She works as a professor of psychology at the University of Montana and is a licensed clinical psychologist who works with individuals and couples to manage stress. And then last, we have Chuni from Cambodia. He was a Waisili Professional Fellow in 2013. He is the co-founder and lead trainer of Vipassana, which specializes in leadership development, self-mastery, and team building. He's the author of the book Meditation for Life Power, and we'll talk about how mindfulness can help to alleviate the stress of COVID-19. Uni, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nikki. Well, hello everyone. I'm Uni Amelia, and good. Okay, good late evening from Indonesia. So I'd like to start my slides with this statement. Like a physical one, the psychological organism is injured and opened. The either escapes, pain is felt, and wants to be expressed. I'd like you just to read this. Okay, next. Well, I just this title, Mental Health Awareness, a big homework in Indonesia, perhaps in your countries. And I highlight in this slide is facing natural disaster effect and also pandemic. Okay, please next. Okay, hello again. So what is jenakading.com? Nikki has told you that it is a local organization focusing on mental health education and services. Since 2016, we are based in Central Sulawesi, Indonesia. So we are psychologists, educators, and university students. This one that Nikki has shown us that UN warns of global mental health crisis due to COVID-19 pandemic, and this situation bring me to questions. The first one is, okay, are people aware of their mental state during this COVID-19 pandemic? And the next question is, even if yes, do they know what to do? So actually, these two questions, my team and I already had since the natural disaster. I will explain more later. Okay, next. Okay, I would like to share these facts that happen in Indonesia, mental health facts. There are 260 million people in Indonesia, and we have less than 1,000 psychiatrists and psychologists. Indonesia lacks mental health workers. It is in local context. Palu is the capital city of Central Sulawesi that I live in. We have 390,000 people, but we only have 5 psychologists. And in the bigger context, in Central Sulawesi, we have 3 million people, but we only have 18 psychologists. Okay, next. Okay, I will show you. Actually, this is like it is small in small pictures, but this data is from our Ministry of Health. The data was released in 2018 on August. So I put a circle, a right circle, two right circles there. Central Sulawesi is on the top list among provinces for the people with emotional mental disorders in population age more than 15 years. The same data, the same position, we are on the top list among 34 provinces with people with depressions. If you ask me what are the factors, then what I can say, we have multiple factors behind these facts. Okay, next, please. Okay, just like this, the pictures when the natural disaster, this natural disaster happened a month after the data was released. So I could imagine that the data was still on the, what is it? We will still in the first place after the natural disaster. So what is the relation between natural disaster and mental health? Okay, what happened to human soul after a traumatic natural disaster? What I got, next please. Okay, according to APA, American Psychological Association, the following are common symptoms of trauma. So not only for traumatic natural disaster, the feelings become intense, sometimes are unpredictable. We get mood swings, anxiety, and also depression. We do flashbacks. We always remember the vivid memories of the event that lead us to physical reactions such as rapid heartbeat or sweating. We have sleep and eating issues, and then we are afraid that the traumatic event will be repeated. And then physical symptoms such as headaches, nausea, and chest pain, and of course a change in interpersonal relationship skills. We might face increasing conflicts. Well, I'd like to show you this, the possible cycles of psychotrauma. I got this from a training that we follow after the traumatic disaster, two weeks after the traumatic disaster. So after a traumatic event, there is an acute phase. It lasts 1 to 2 days, and normally it will lead people to post-traumatic reaction that will last up to 8 weeks. And if this post-traumatic reaction is not treated well, people may face the next harder phase, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, and it perhaps lasts until several years. And again, if this phase is not under good treatment, it will last, and perhaps people will have more difficult mental illness. So our team is working on the post-traumatic reaction, this phase that up to 8 weeks. Okay, next. And then what did our team provide supporting people, especially children's mental health condition after the traumatic disaster? The first thing we have to prepare a safe place. We create safe place, we ensure the protection and acceptance. We didn't talk about the natural disaster. We don't repeat the stories. So we allow the students to feel sad, to process their emotion. Even they said, okay, they are afraid of beach, they're afraid of high building. We accept that, but we don't repeat the event. And we did therapeutic therapy, which transforms local language, music, and gesture into movement sequences. And we do art therapy through painting and drawing. There was an art therapy came to to train us. We do storytelling, we do crafting. We do these things for 3 until 4 months. Okay, next. So what I can share is, because we are having the fact that we lack of psychologists and psychiatrists, we lack of mental health centers. So we have to work in every aspect. We work in promotive, preventive, curative, and rehabilitative aspects. In promotive, we have to advocate the local government. We come to the local government, we talk to them that this mental health is the big issue, and we spread the mental health awareness and knowledge to the village communities. We have 4 intervention village communities, And for the preventive things, we are requiring 8 mental health cadres or agents in each village. So each village has 2 mental health cadres. They are our team that are, we train them, and they are becoming our link to spread the mental health awareness to the local people in the village that they live. And then for the curative aspects, we place 2 psychologists at the community health centers in 2 villages. For your information, there are only some health centers in Indonesia that have psychologists, and we are the first place in Sulawesi and even in East Indonesia that having psychologist service at community health centers for free. So people don't have to spend money to see the psychologist. And for the rehabilitative aspects, we provide advanced counseling services at our clinic. We have our own clinic since 2017. Well, for the additional action we do during pandemic COVID-19, of course, we have individual online counseling. Until now, we have webinar service. We started the first webinar tomorrow, and that we do YouTube and broadcast WhatsApp message to spread of the information about mental health, and then the updated information from government. And then we do group counseling for health workers. So we know that health workers having difficult time in this moment, in this pandemic COVID-19. So we have group counseling for them, and we do more and more collaboration with other organizations and local government. And again, these are the 2 lines. What I can say that we are focusing on building protective factors. We build people resilience, we build people coping strategies, and we train them. We train them to encounter negative situation capacity, because we know that we may face the similar or even the same traumatic situations years later. Okay, next. So if people ask me, why do we talk about mental health? And I will answer, why don't? Okay, thank you. That's all. I would like to see any comments or questions.
Yeah, thank you, Uni. We will wait for comments and questions. We'll go to Chris now.
Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you and to be able to talk about this challenging subject. There's been so much presented already on a lot of the aspects of mental health that are that every country is facing. I participated in the Women's Empowerment Exchange. It started in 2012, but I went to Thailand in 2013. It was a wonderful experience. Because I have a background in interpersonal violence against women, I did work focusing on that in Bangkok and Chiang Mai, and it was a wonderful experience. You can move the slide. So I would say, despite our cultural differences, a lot of what people have talked about are challenges in the US in facing the mental health issues and COVID. And one of the things about the US is that our healthcare system we have both a government healthcare system that is provided for people in poverty and senior citizens, and then we have healthcare that costs money that people have to pay for, that usually is associated with employment, and mental health care costs money. So we have a mixed system of access to mental health care. When COVID happened, we were allowed to do telehealth, but we were not allowed to do telehealth even in the government system. And telehealth includes mental health care through the telephone for people who may only have telephones and not computers, or the computer. And a lot of people have moved to platforms like Zoom to provide mental health to individuals, couples, and families. So this has changed things in terms of, it seems like that would increase access, but we still have challenges to access because of, say, misinformation or cost of mental health care. We have mental health care in the schools, but when children go home and are isolated at home, the delivery of mental health care has been challenging and not the same. We also have stigma about seeking mental health care in the United States, mostly related, I would say, to individualism and the idea that if you need mental health assistance, you're weak or something's wrong with you, instead of taking care of yourself and your family. So we have that to overcome. So some of our challenges are how to get people connected to care, how to overcome the shame about needing care, and if people lose jobs, how do they pay for care or get access to care? Next slide. The American Psychological Association has identified the most common response to COVID right now is what they're calling Coveted Anxiety. And it is many of the things that were mentioned in the slide earlier by Nikki, and people, when they have anxiety, can have anxiety and worry or depression, and some people can also experience trauma. And I'll talk about trauma in the next slides. And the recommendations related to this are to minimize exposure to media and social media information that's alarming or difficult. This is for both adults or children, because there's misinformation on social media, and media is giving instructions in every direction, and it's pretty clearly been associated that a lot of media exposure increases people's anxiety and worry. So kind of having good judgment about that. Seeking support from family, friends, and important others when possible by phone or computer as well, because in the social isolation, it really exacerbates and is known to make anxiety and depression worse. It's also very challenging what people are going through. You know, it's so complex, whether you've lost jobs, you're being forced to work. A lot of food service people are really anxious about getting COVID because they are supposed to work, where other people are anxious and at home because they've lost their jobs. So the reason for anxiety is so varying, and the need for social connection so important to well-being and mental health. And then there's the recommendation to use the specific expertise of mental health professionals if other efforts aren't working. And that's really wonderful to say, and then tricky to do in the US. So what mental health professionals have is that really a specific amount of training in anxiety and worry. And one of the things I want to emphasize, because I thought Uni's description was so good, and Shreya also describing the experiences, is that a lot of mental health interventions actually are culturally based and culturally measured and tested. And in the United States, one of the stronger treatments for anxiety, worry, and trauma is something called trauma-focused CBT, or it's called exposure. And you actually do tell your story, and you talk about it over and over until your story doesn't create anxiety and worry, which is exactly different than how Uni described approaching it. And that, again, is probably culturally based. So I would be careful about anything that I'm saying we're using in the US, and be aware that it might need to be modified, or it might be different for other cultures. And that's something that we attempt to do all the time in our research, is to test whether or not our approaches in the US really apply to different cultural and ethnic groups. Typically, practitioners work with the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that impact managing stress and coping with COVID, and consider social and personal context. You know, if you're living in poverty versus you are comfortably able to be in your own home and safely distance yourself, you have very different stressors. And cognitive behavior therapy and emotion-focused therapy are two approaches that really work on how these experiences can be managed when they become overwhelming. The one thing that I think a lot of the time that has been mentioned also by Uni is that people forget that the frontline workers who are dedicated to helping people really are also experiencing overwhelming depression, anxiety, and trauma, and that they may need mental health support more than anyone predicted because of their exposure to very challenging situations and their own exposure to potentially contracting COVID. And so there's been a big challenge about how to meet the mental health needs in those situations, because people are so busy and overwhelmed and isolated when they're not working. So that group of people, there's special reach out for mental health healthcare professionals facing COVID. And it's, I would say it's customized to their types of exposure. And it's only delivered for people who want it, because that's also been something that people have been sensitive to, that you actually can make things worse for people who aren't ready for treatment, who are in constant traumatic environments. Overall, the need for compassion and understanding are really important for all people facing the challenges of COVID, and really essential to well-being, knowing that we're all in a very difficult place. We're all going to cope differently and have different emotional and psychological needs during this time. Next slide. So trauma, basically, I've alluded to already. One of the things about trauma that I would say is, in the US, the research is that because you're exposed to a traumatic event or a traumatic situation like COVID, doesn't mean you'll develop post-traumatic stress disorder. In the US, on average, post-traumatic stress disorder in its technical diagnosis develops only 50% of the time. And what that means is that there's likely for us to do a lot of preventative and supporting, resilience building, like Uni said, things to help people with not developing long-term problems related to traumatic exposure. So we really make an effort to do kind of school-wide or community-based education on how to help yourself and get support. And we have a special difficulty, I would say, in the US with our seniors in senior centers. And there's a lot of work being done because of the cutoff from families for seniors who aren't able to see families during COVID isolation. Next slide. This is just a description of the types of things that create traumatic situation around COVID on the right. And one of the most important things about us as human organisms is to know that we are biologically built to manage trauma, that it doesn't have to happen, that we have biologically a fight, flight, fright response, and we also have a adrenal pituitary axis that helps us on a daily basis manage stress. So if we work on getting good sleep and some of the things that I think Chuni's going to talk about, mindfulness and ways to calm ourselves and process and manage stressors better, we can actually focus on the strengths we have as human beings to manage the traumas that we face. Because as human beings, they are going to happen more than once. COVID is kind of an unprecedented, global pandemic affecting all of us simultaneously, but as beings, we are built for this. We have to learn how to harness it and use our abilities effectively. I think that's my last slide. Yep. The last slide that I have is just a lot of resources. So if anybody's interested, there's a lot of information out there on how to cope with COVID impacts. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris, for your work and linking some of these talks that we've had. Chuni, we are eager to hear from you now.
Hi, everyone. I'm from Cambodia. It's wonderful to be here with you all. So as Christine or Uni been already present a lot already, I will just talk a little bit. Okay. Just looking Cambodia with 16 million of population. It's only 35 trained psychiatrists and 45 psychiatric nurses are available for the whole country, for entire country. So we don't have enough resource to help support with that. We say an estimate of 40% of Cambodian people are suffer from mental health or psychological problem, because back around 35 years ago, back in 1970 or 1975, there was a Khmer Rouge time where more than half of Cambodian people were killed back then. So that problem still got affected up until now. So within this period of COVID-19 hit it, so the whole country got affected, but we didn't see anyone who would die from this as well. But because of the social media got spread so fast in Cambodia, Cambodia is one of a consumering country, a big consuming countries, and a developing country where people want to see things modern and use a lot of technology. And I would say the first week when the COVID hit, majority of the people are having trouble, live with fears of all of those things. It was really hard, and many people also take advantage of using selling the mask and the alcohol. So I would say many people got rich from that, got a lot of money from that situation. So myself, I have a community called Meditation Community One, another one called Mindful Monday Community with the monk. He's one of the I would say one of the most influential monk in Cambodia. So he partnered with the Ministry of Education to produce video on YouTube, on Facebook, to help calm down the feeling of the people who are fear and scared and affected from this COVID-19. So his video been really helpful, and myself also have two community online. I have a Friday. Every Friday, we hold a session on mindfulness and meditation with a Cambodian Buddhist monk who live in United States, Cambodian Buddhist monk who live in Sri Lanka and in Cambodia, and myself, we co-host it weekly every Friday. And also, beside this program, on my personal work, also do a lot of online meditation as well, because I do believe that when we have fear, when we have panic or intense, we lose an ability to solve the problem, because let's say COVID is already here. the pandemic is already here, so we can't do anything right away. The most important thing is to help calm ourselves down, to help manage our own emotion, but also to help take care, make sure that we sleep well, we eat enough, so that we can fight this problem. Now we see that people are okay now. The Cambodia is not, the whole country not locked down. I mean, still open. And at this situation, we only have 2 new cases. 2 people are under treatment, but majority of them already recover from the problem. So the strategy that we offer, mostly, I mean, the monk who are partner with the Ministry of Education is really helpful, because the video target the parent, but also target the kid as well, because kid can't go to school. They spend a lot of time on phone using the online template learning. So sometimes it's not good as well, because when they use too much of that, that's why mindfulness is also help them to be able to take it back, to be able to focus on what they're doing. We have a program for adults, but also we have a mindfulness program for the kid as well. I probably just say for now, if you have any more questions, you can, because I see Uni and Christine already been present a lot already. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Chuni. Yeah, we had a lot of different perspectives on thinking about mental health, the various stressors around the world, and then approaches for how we deal with it. We invite you to put some questions in the chat box, and Heidi, we can actually take the slide off and just see everyone's faces here. There were some people who had earlier some questions about mental health and how we address the stigma that is associated with it. Ali had an interesting quote from people in Mali about being fearful of people who are mentally ill. We know the struggles of mental health range a whole spectrum from anxiety to mental illness, and there's a range of ways that we heard today to try to address mental health. But one of the specific questions, maybe I'll ask Uni right now, when you were working in the village level, did you encounter any issues implementing your project due to stigma against mental health and illness? And if so, how did you address this?
Yes, of course, we're facing stigma that people think if you go to psychiatrist or if you go to psychologist means that you're crazy, something bad happened with you, you're not religious, you're not praying. So what we got is we invited the mothers in the village to just talk about the issues that happen in the news. So we ask them to think. We talk about the factors behind the event. So we make them thinking and finding their own answer.
Do any other of the panelists want to address stigma and mental health as a barrier and how you overcome that? You know, there's many ways that people have working with mental health. One of the other questions that came in is that given there is a scarcity of mental health professionals globally, what are some of the creative ways that we can provide these services? Chris Fiore mentioned telehealth. Uni also provides some services online. I know Danielle works very creatively to support mental health by engaging in sports, even during the pandemic, doing that through the homes to help with mental well-being. So what are we've talked a lot about some of the real challenges globally with mental health. How do we provide services right now during the pandemic in creative ways, thinking, given the real scarcity of professionals? Maybe Chris, you could speak to this.
So for Americans, but there are international groups within American Psychological Association. They are really trying to use online as much as possible. And they are doing groups online, similar to this, where there are as many people who want to learn about mindfulness and how to manage stress or how to calm the body, or we've been studying the stigma of mental health for many years, and one of the things that keeps coming up is that if mental health, if the brain isn't separated from the body in how we approach everything, if we acknowledge that we're all one body and being, we then should have mental health as part of a doctor's visit, or that's why we've started mental health in the schools, so that it's really seamlessly a part of everything we do when we take care of ourselves. And mental health and sports, we have sports psychology, and sports psychology is also about optimizing your performance, but it's also about managing psychological challenges in sports, and how sports both can be helpful and how we need to manage if somebody who's in sports is having problems with depression. So the idea of destigmatizing is to bring it into everything instead of having it be a separate part of what we address. And what a lot of people are doing is not calling it mental health, they're calling it behavioral health, or they're calling it integrative health as a way of trying to say our minds are not separate from our bodies. We are all one, and our health depends on addressing everything, not these pieces separately. So that's one of the newer efforts to try to address stigma. But the COVID efforts are using as much online as possible and opening groups and making them free, because that's a big issue in the US, and inviting people nationally and internationally, always with an awareness that there are cultural differences and how we manage and cope with stress.
So please, Nikki, I just would like to come back on the question of stigma. And, you know, in Mali, we know that stigma is one of the big challenges, but in order to fight against it here, it's the family members plays a huge role, because here after this problem, so it's the family usually take the person in question to different activities, social activities like wedding, marriage. So they do their best so that to show to the rest of the community that the person is now okay, so there is no problem. So this is the main thing that really we're really doing here, but there is no organization that really deal with this right now. So this is what I just wanted to add about the stigma here in Mali. So I would like also to come back on a question that had been asked by Ratana, I think, if I pronounce well the name. So I think she asked a question about, so what to do, what is the solution that we are doing, for example, for somebody who has lost his job during this COVID-19 to prevent from the mental health issue. I lost my job during this time. So what I do is that first I have, let's say, I have my personal company, but I teach English in this organization, in the company. But due to the COVID-19, this has been also stopped. But what I do is that I start doing other activities. For example, I look for, let's say, trade business in with software and many other stuffs in the market, and then I do that. So this keeps me busy. And when I'm not doing anything there, I'm working on my computer, writing short stories, things like this. So I do my best in order to keep busy and not really lose all things, let's say, mental. Yeah, that's the point I wanted to add.
Thank you so much, Ali. So we have one person had asked for Chuni to talk about what are some of the mindfulness exercises you lead for the virtual groups.
Thank you, Nikki. Because normally we have when doing the big group in person, we have a lot of different activity, but within this period, so mindfulness exercise, the first week, the first 7 days, we help them, guide them to understand when they breathe, understand their own breathing in and out, and help them to understand why breathing is important. And then we help them to be aware of their own movement. We call let's just say, at least understand when we angry, when we upset, when we feel happy. So we need to be aware of those feelings. But the most important thing is that to be aware with our own breathing in and out. So when we breathe in, let's just say 1, 2, 3, 4 in, and 1, 2, 3, 4 out. Learn how to connect with ourselves first, because when we are able to connect with ourselves, then we can learn how to reflect more. We can learn how to understand more of our body and also our mind as well. When we, for example, when we feel sad, when we feel happy or not happy, all of those things, it could be mostly from ourselves, not from the outside world. So that's why it's important to really be aware of our own body and our own mind, our own, we call in meditation, we call 4 foundations of mindfulness: aware of our body, aware of our own word, aware of our own action, aware of our own mind. Let's say when we talk, we know that we're talking. When we walk, we know that we're walking. When we think, we know that we're thinking. When we angry, we know that we are angry. But all of that just start with understand the breath first, breathing in and out first. Yeah.
Thank you. Next for Danielle, can you speak a little more to how sport and exercise, even stuck at home alone, can support mental well-being?
Yeah, sure. Well, the first difficulty of this is that usually sports is meant to be played outside your house. We work with soccer as a sport to develop social skills. And we started sending videos to families. So from some basic things about how making, for example, a soccer ball inside your house made of socks or made of material that you can reuse from other activities. And then usually every week we send them different activities that can mix these approaches, not only to maintain families active, because, for example, we try to make some exercises about skipping, but at the end of the exercise, you should say some good thing that you have experienced this week. So this is meant to be for children that they can do with their parents or what, whoever they live with. So they can create these spaces where they can talk. Okay, first exercise is about good things that has happened to you. Then the other exercise is about your responsibilities. And then at the end, it's about things that you have been scared of this week. So this is a way to create this space so children can talk to their parents about how they are feeling. I think it's something, for example, we're using some mindfulness activities too, so they can breathe, they can be guided to that, to acknowledge what they are feeling, what they're going through, in order to prevent some mental health issues. There are also, technology is a very good ally in this, because we can make a video and we can share them to the world. Actually, all the material we have is in Spanish, but if anybody wants to get access to it, they can write me and I can send it to all of you.
Thank you. It's remarkable the expertise that we have among our alumni and the resources all of you are for each other. There's a question in the chat box that I will read. It is appreciated if you could talk about any experiences and ideas you have to address well-being problems during COVID-19 in the remote areas where there's no accessibility of mental health and psychosocial support. Anyone want to take that on? I think we heard a little bit. Clearly, Chuni is doing work remotely. Do you want to speak to that?
Can I hear the question again, please?
Yeah, the question is specifically about providing mental health services in remote areas that do not have accessibility to mental health care providers.
Thank you. So in Cambodia, we have a culture where we have temples. The temple in every village, we have temple. So by responding to that, we also have a lot of Buddhist monks who help. They either go out to do some kind of blessing, or people come to the temple and learn about meditation or listen to the Dhamma so that they can feel better. Because it's hard to gather a big group, but in every temple there's a monk who always help with that, mainly with this COVID-19. There's a lot of Buddhist monks have become more active than ever, because I mean, Cambodia, Facebook become like one of the biggest social media, social connection in remote area. If there's no TV or all of those technology, but again, there's a temple, because I mean, there's thousands of temples all over the places. So the monk, I mean, this is what it is in Cambodia. So the monk help, yeah.
I want to add to that. I think that making good relationships with these local connections, it's really important in these kind of cases, because, for example, we have communities that don't have access to internet, so we can't send them videos by WhatsApp or something like that. But there is a local market, or there is like a local the municipality, or there is this leader of the community that has a cell phone that we can share material with them, and then they can go and share it with everybody. We send them posters with information. We send them like brochures about what they can do at the activities they can practice in their houses, and we send that regularly. So it's important that you establish a good relationship with some local actor or actress on that community. Even though if it's remote, you can at least get this point of contact, and then they can spread the word to the others.
Right. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention two more things that the government also help with. There's a motorbike. I don't know how to say, not a scooter, a motorbike, kind of a big, taller than scooter. So there's a motorbike, but there's also a big microphone voice. So they move from village to village, so they play the sound. And there's also a local truck who travel from village to village as well. They play a loud sound so that the remote people can hear what's going on and how to protect or how to manage their own emotion, but also how to stay clean in whatever way respond to the situation. So there's a way like that we do in Cambodia.
So Nikki, if we have some time, I'd like to make two very quick points. Do we have the time for it?
Yeah, go ahead, Shreya.
So what I really think is that when we are talking about accessing or reaching out to communities that are not within, let's say, which are in remote areas as such, or do not have access to information like most of us do, what has really worked for India is the fact that the messaging needs to be very impactful, and messages need to be broken down for communities to be able to articulate them. So for example, the kind of messages that we receive on our social media needs to be further broken down in the community language for the community to understand better what is the crisis like, what should they do to protect their communities. And as my friends mentioned already, I think that is where the role of community leaders becomes very, very important. However, what we've also observed in India is that this should not lead to further misinformation. So while community leaders do have a very huge impact in the coronavirus as such, because they essentially are the link between the government and the people, the kind of information that is going out to the people should really be monitored by the government as such. The second important thing that has worked for India is we have healthcare workers, frontline workers who work in rural areas and are called Asha Workers. Now, these are women who are really working in extreme rural areas in the country, and they have literally gone door to door explaining about Corona, the crisis, and the ways to beat not just mental health, but to take care of families and individuals. And really why that has worked is because that person is accessible, that you know that person individually, and therefore you feel more comfortable and you feel more confident about dealing with the crisis. So I feel in this scenario, what has really worked for the government is reaching out to these community leaders, reaching out to teachers so that they can spread the message among students and make them feel a little more confident, a little more positive about the kind of crisis that we are going through. Because I think even within school students and college students, it becomes really hard to deal with this idea that there is a bleak future and you don't really know when things are going to set back to what is assumed to be normal. So I feel that while information is going out, A, it needs to be properly monitored, and B, it needs to be broken down further so that it becomes accessible and easily understood by most people in the community.
Thank you, Shreya. There's a question from Tanya. In group gatherings with youth, is it good to ask about COVID situation in every gathering? So Shreya, you were just talking about information, maybe too much information. So I don't know if I fully understand the question, but is it good to ask about COVID, the COVID situation in every gathering?
I think mostly our narrative is generally around Corona now. That's what I actually tried to mention in my presentation earlier, that most of the information that we're consuming now is essentially about COVID. So it really makes it very hard to think about other things in your life except, you wake up and you read about all of these numbers and the strategies and the projections, and it makes you really scared. But I honestly feel that it is, again, a very big privilege to take our mind off coronavirus, but I think it's also very necessary at this stage, which has personally worked for me to think about other constructive things. And for example, this webinar, so I feel that probably it's not a good idea because it constantly reinforces this feeling of helplessness in not just yourself, but also people around you.
Yeah, and this brings up the important question about, is it good to raise the topic of COVID with youth? So how much do we expose our children to this pandemic, and how do we talk to them about it? Maybe Chris, you could speak to this because you do a lot of work with children.
So again, in the US and the work that we're doing here, it's recommended to be able to talk about it so that people aren't afraid to talk about it and hold their worries. Children and family members keep their worries to themselves and then become sleepless or sick about it. But it also is important to know the limit on it, that it's not too much in making kids anxious or worrying about their parents dying and their grandparents dying, and then being sleepless because they're worrying about that. So it's a balancing act about how much of this is discussed. A lot of the recommendations are about parents keeping the parent and adult level worry separate from their children, because children don't have the cognitive or brain understanding developmentally to know what parent worry is in a grand scheme of things. So to try to talk about financial worries and things, and even if there is a family member who has COVID and there's worry about them dying, to limit that kind of exposure. and to have parents worry between each other, and just talk about children's feelings at a child level and not too much. Let them be kids, let them have kid life and kid joys and sports and, you know, whatever they can do to be a child. But it is a balancing act. But in the US, there is belief in our culture and in our research that discussing and labeling your emotions, similar to what Chuni was saying about in mindfulness, being aware of your anger, being aware of your worry, and then learning how to regulate and manage it instead of avoid it or hide it, because the worry is that it becomes more of a problem when we don't acknowledge it. Now, again, these are very culture bound. We are very different as cultures on what we do with these things. So the US research and with the US cultures, that's how we are recommending approaching it. But it's really complex. Too much isn't good, too little isn't good. There's somewhere in the middle that is manageable for our psyches and our physiology.
Thank you, Chris. So the next question I want to address relates to how in many parts of the world right now, we are seeing increases in violence, protests, and unrest. Is there some perspective from mental health that we can help us understand the trends that are happening with violence? And secondly, in a culture with a stigma around mental health, how do we face this? If there are links to mental health that are relating to and causing and amplifying violence around the world. I guess to reiterate, is there a connection between mental health and the violence we're seeing? And if so, how do we address this when there's stigmas around mental health?
So this is a really hard one, right? It's very hard. I would say what most people in the US as psychologists are doing with this, the American Psychological Association has called the violence a result of a pandemic of racism and oppression, and that we have problems in American culture, and it's clear because of the worldwide response that all cultures have class, race, and bias issues within culture, where some people are less and perceived as less, treated as less, and oppressed and harmed and have violence against them. And of course, the George Floyd situation was police violence, when our police are supposed to be protecting us. Instead, in certain racial and ethnic groups, they're more likely to be harmed. That's a very horrible situation in a time where we also have a huge pandemic where there's so many unknowns, and it is disproportionately in the US, and I think a few others have talked about this, harming people of poverty and lower class or specific racial or ethnic groups disproportionately. So for example, the Navajo reservation in the US has had a high proportion of deaths, and it's about access to water and care, and also cultural ways of behaving that are hard to change when you spend a lot of time in a community. So spread is more likely. And I think Shreya talked about this just in terms of living circumstances, depending on how close you are. So there are these unfairness pieces, both about how people are treated in the world by their system, their government system, and people in their culture, and then the pandemic is behaving unfairly. And so those two things together, a lot of people believe are just creating a time of really wanting to protest the unfairness of how these things operate in the world and affect us differentially as human beings. What do we do about it? I think taking action to change it in every way at the system level is what everybody's hoping will happen. That even though all this is horrific, unfair, and horrible, that it's an opportunity for change and to address it instead of let it continue.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chris. That might actually be a good note to end on. We have just a couple of minutes left. I will want to point out that there's been a lot of great chat in the chat box. We didn't get to everyone's questions, but clearly people have found this to be an informative and interesting session. It's never easy to talk about mental health. It's a really complex situation for each individual, as well as the complexity of what's happening in the globe and how we understand it from the framework of our well-being. We have wonderful alumni working to support people in communities, and it feels really great to be together to talk about this and learn a little bit about what each of you are doing. As a follow-up, we're going to share some resources on our Facebook sites, email our alumni with a link to a survey to ask you to complete about today, and invite you to continue this conversation in the various forums we have. All of our panelists will make sure you have their contact information in case you want to reach out and communicate more with all of these. You know, I think just having a conversation like this for me is helpful for my own mental health and well-being, knowing that we are all focused on these issues, focused on being the best possible person we can be to support our families and our communities, and finding different ways to support each other. So thank you all for being with us. Thank you so much to our panelists for preparing your remarks and being here today. We love seeing you with the Montana image behind you, and have loved having all of our alumni here today. So thank you, and we will say goodbye now.